It's the BBC scandal that's been described as worse than phone hacking. And let's be honest, that was deplorable enough. We speak to Andy Webb, whose new book, Dianarama, lays bare the nefarious tactics employed by Martin Bashir to secure his famous Panorama interview with Princess Diana.
Andy lays out the lies that Bashir told, the cover-up that took place within the BBC, and we examine, did these events lead to Diana's early death?
Now, had that happened, at that point, all these awful, other terrible things would have emerged, Diana would have been briefed, and that is why history would have been different. Because it's not going too far to paint a scenario where Diana doesn't end up in the Paris tunnel. She's here today. She's 64 years old. She's got 5 grandkids.
Tim, it was arguably one of the most, if not the most famous royal interview in history.
Yes.
Princess Diana, a doe-eyed princess, speaking to the BBC's Martin Bashir for a Panorama special in 1995.
Yeah, I was very young. I don't think I was allowed to watch it. I think
I remember it
was
quite
a bit saucy,
vividly.
Wasn't it?
I mean, people were talking about it for weeks and months. It went off and won awards. It was meant to be this bastion. It was meant to represent this sort of Rubicon having been crossed with such an intimate interview.
Yes.
Between journalist and royal. Yes, Prince Charles had done his Dimbleby interview where he admitted to a degree of infidelity.
Yes.
And this was Princess Diana in the War of the Waleses. It was almost at its peak as she hit back and gave her side of the story.
Talking like a human being, humanising the royal family.
Precisely.
And dramatically changing the way that we see that institution and the people inside it.
But that story has, over the course of recent years, turned into a nightmare as it has been revealed just how nefarious the tactics that Martin Bashir employed actually were.
The reality of how it's made is as shocking as finding that the moon landings were faked. Right, it's as big as the original story.
Quite right.
How they went about making this.
And we wouldn't know how it was made if it wasn't for the man who joins us in the studio now, Andy Webb. Welcome to the Daily Tea. Thank you very much. We're here to discuss your new book, Dianarama, which takes us inside the Panorama interview and lays bare not just a conspiracy, Andy, but a cover-up by the BBC. So let's go back to the very beginning. What was your role in all this originally?
Originally, my role, well, let me put it this way. When all this was, I worked for the BBC for best part of 20 years. When all this was actually going down, coincidentally, I've only just sort of remembered this, really, but my desk at the BBC was about 100 feet from Martin Bashir's desk. When I first began to pursue this story was actually 2007. You know, there was a real bad smell over what had happened about that interview, and I can tell you that smell was very apparent within the BBC, within the corridors of the BBC. It was known that something had gone wrong. 2007, I put in my first Freedom of Information request to the BBC saying, look, there must be documents to do with an inquiry that we know took place, et cetera, back in the day. And they came back with what is, your lawyers don't need to be worried about this, it was a lie.
Yes.
It was a lie. The BBC lied in black and white and said to me, and the document is in my office, we don't have any such documents. And we know that they did have lots and lots of documents. So that's when it began, in 2007. Over the succeeding years, I tried on many, many occasions to get a substantial documentary, television documentary, because that's what I'm doing now, made on this. And I say in the book, I think I've coined the phrase protective notoriety. And by that I mean the sort of aura that I think surrounded Jimmy Savile, for instance, whereby everybody knows he's a wrong-un. And so it's not news anymore. And when I was trying to pitch the notion of what Bashir had done, we knew at that point that he had commissioned forged documents. We weren't at all sure then what he'd done with his forged documents, but merely a Panorama reporter to have, why do you need forged documents to get your interview? So we knew that much. I tried to pitch the documentary, but the problem was, well, look, as I say, there's something wrong with this interview, but it's not kind of fresh enough, it's not news enough to merit it. Cutting to what happened in 2020, finally, the BBC did send to me some documents under FOI, and it was Freedom of Information. It was just one of those documents that the BBC sent to me that purported to show that Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, far from him being, and it sounds completely bizarre, far from him being shown fake documents by Bashir, this document sent to me by the BBC said that it was Spencer who'd shown Bashir bank statements.
Right.
Which was like, okay. This is 48 hours before my film is due to air. I emailed a copy of this document to Charles Spencer, somebody who at that point I had not spoken to before.
Right.
Once. And as soon as he got it, or a couple of hours after he got it, the phone rang, Charles Spencer rang me, and the whole bizarre, lurid, sordid story unfolded.
Right, so let's take a step back. How did Martin Bashir, a relatively junior journalist, not that many good contacts, up against rivals like David Frost, who were also desperate for it, how did he persuade Diana to sit down for an interview?
You're quite right. David Frost, Oprah Winfrey, even back Oprah Winfrey had been chasing the interview, Barbara Walters, they'd been for lunch at Kensington Palace, all politely about how did Martin Bashir do it? Well, Martin Bashir did very, very, very skillfully what people in our profession, occasionally, unfortunately, there are people such as this, who very, very skillfully are able to decide to construct a completely false scenario of one kind or another and pass themselves off as genuine. That's how Martin Bashir, somebody, perhaps unkindly said at this point, he's not even a household name in his own household.
No.
He's not. He's
No.
not Oprah Winfrey. He's not David Frost. He's not, indeed, Andrew Morton. In the book, it's described. Andrew Morton, whom Diana did trust at this point, had been chasing her for a TV interview, if you like, almost a long follow-up to the book that he'd done. How did Bashir do it? Well, the methods by which Bashir got his foot in the door, which were via Charles Spencer, who was effectively Diana's gatekeeper, if you like, at this point.
This is her brother.
Her brother. Martin Bashir is able to get past Charles Spencer's sort of bristling hostility or suspicion of the media. He's successful there. But once he is in the inner sanctum, if you like, literally in Diana's sitting room in Kensington Palace, he unfolds this extraordinary litany of terrifying, bizarre, terrifying stories backed up with faked documents. And people have said, and I think it's really important, people have said that Diana was paranoid.
Well, her own
Paranoid.
sons have said that. Prince William
Well,
said.
absolutely. But I'm going to say, with all due respect, I think that's somewhat unkind because paranoid sounds to me like some kind of, psychiatric diagnosis. If let's say, don't forget, Martin Bashir is from the BBC. He's there in his wire-rimmed glasses. He's from the BBC, not just the BBC, but from Panorama.
Very highly
Hugely,
respected
hugely
show,
respected.
yeah.
If David Attenborough were to come up to me and whisper that, I've got to tell you, your wife is planning to have you murdered.
Yes.
And I've got some documents to prove. Well, you'd
listen.
You'd absolutely.
So she didn't
listen.
need to have a mental health condition to be hoodwinked by Bashir. But just explain, Andy, what did these documents convince her of?
Well, okay. One of the key sources in my book is Patrick Jeffson.
Yes,
who for
her
8
private
years
secretary.
was Diana's private secretary.
Wholly loyal. I must, conflict of interests declared. I know Patrick. We share an agent, darling. I don't mind telling you that, Tim. He is a thoroughly upstanding. He is a thoroughly upstanding member of not only the royal household but the public. Thoroughly decent man who, just for context, could not understand for the life of him why one day, after 8 years of loyalty to Princess Diana, being her right-hand man, her close confidant, her chief advisor, she suddenly cut him loose.
That's right. That's
Andy,
right. Absolutely.
why did she?
because just one of the many falsehoods, lies that Bashir had to pass on was that Patrick Jefferson was in the pay of what Bashir was sort of calling dark forces. Now, whether the dark forces were MI5, MI6, GCHQ, who knows? But
or the press.
No,
he wasn't implying that, right?
It was implied much, but it was some
Wow.
sinister Secret Service thing. And not only that, but Bashir had had produced forged bank statements purporting to show that Patrick Jefferson had received, we can say loosely, about £40,000. He and a chap called Richard Aylard, who was working for Prince Charles at the time. So Bashir had, provided evidence, as far as he was concerned, that Patrick Jefferson was on the take to spy on Diana and report back to these people. So that's why Diana parted company very quickly with Patrick Jefferson. Patrick, interestingly enough, as I say, was a very important source for the book. I sent him, as soon as we received hard copies of the book, which is not published for another week or so, as soon as I received 4 hard copies, and the first one I sent was to Patrick, because I thought it was so important that he saw what had been written, and I'm glad to say he came back and he, it meant an enormous amount to Patrick when I was able to find out why what you've just described, why that happened, why did Diana? Because Patrick, for 25 years, didn't know.
So I, again, because I know him, I've had lunch with him, spent quite a lot of time with him. He literally spent 25 years of his life not knowing why his principal, somebody he cared deeply about professionally and personally, cut him loose. And
it's because Martin Bashir lied to her about him.
It was the most cruel treatment of someone. And he suffered personally a great deal because it made him look as if there was something wrong with him, and then he had to move to America, and it basically sullied what had been a completely exemplary career in royal service.
Well, and then for her to die the way she did, it would really...
One very poignant thing which he said to me was that, and this can't be changed now, but what he finds utterly heartbreaking is that Diana clearly went to her death believing that he had betrayed her.
Yes.
There was no chance to correct that impression. As you say, for 25 years, he didn't know why, she held these beliefs.
For context, just before you say that, for context, you should also know that she didn't tell Jefferson she was doing the interview with Bashir. She didn't tell anyone until after it had been recorded.
Right.
Presumably because Bashir had persuaded her to keep it a secret. Now, if he hadn't have done that, people may well have raised completely sincere and well-meaning objections to her doing it. But that's another part of this whole sorry saga.
How did Bashir get his hands on such convincing forgeries?
Well, there are 2 sets of forgeries. The first set of forgeries we can talk about because we've seen them. There are copies of them that exist. That set of forgeries, he went to a freelance graphic designer who'd worked for the BBC, who was then working freelance, called Matt Wiesler, who's also, I spent a lot of time in Matt and tell his story in the book. And Bashir went to Matt, out of hours actually, he went to his apartment in Camden, where he was living at the time, and said, Matt, I'll pay you 250, or the BBC will pay you £250. I want you to produce 2 things that look very, very much like NatWest bank statements with this information in this bank account number, this address, and these figures. And they were completely fake, forgery, etc., etc. But Bashir wanted these documents, and he wanted them to look very, very believable, because these were the documents that he produced on the first occasion when he met Charles Spencer.
Right.
And the point of having these documents, from Bashir's point of view, was that it would suggest, indeed prove, that he was indeed somebody who had really, really important sources. He was able to get hold of this sort of financial information. For what it's worth, what the bank statements are supposed to have shown was that somebody who used to work for Charles Spencer had been taking bungs from
Yeah.
the tabloids. He hadn't, etc., because they're complete fakes. But the point of them, from Bashir's point of view, was that it suggested that he did indeed have genuine sources.
And on that, as you point out, in regards to Princess Diana not really being paranoid, but just understandably taken in by a man who was supposed to be a reputable journalist from a respectable organisation. Similarly, if you're Charles Spencer, Tim, and you are presented with what appear to be NatWest bank statements, at no point in your cognizance are you thinking, oh, hang on a minute, I wonder if Bashir has gone to a graphic designer and had these knocked up. Because it's just so unfathomable to even consider deploying these sorts of tactics.
Especially when it's someone from the BBC.
It's the BBC.
You assume. So Diana is shown these things which encourage her paranoia. How then does he leverage that paranoia into her agreeing to an interview?
Diana wasn't shown any fake bank statements.
Right.
The fake bank statements were not for Diana. They were to get in the door. They were shown to Charles Spencer. Okay. What Bashir does when he has got into Kensington Palace is he then unfolds a quite extraordinary litany of falsehoods. I mean, utterly, utterly bizarre. I mean, I've been looking at this story now for many, many years, and I still think it is utterly bizarre, utterly bizarre. The main ones amongst them were this, that at this point in 1995, November 1995, Bashir had been able to convince Diana that the Queen, the late Queen, as it was, Queen Elizabeth, was going to abdicate in 6 months' time. She was going to abdicate in April of 1996. That's one thing. Number two, Prince Charles, as he was then, was planning to have, bizarre, was planning to have both Diana and Camilla Parker Bowles murdered. Both of them murdered. Okay. Why would Prince Charles want to have Diana, who he's then still married to, and Camilla, who was having a relationship with, why would he want to have them murdered? The answer is because, in reality, Prince Charles, and this is all completely fictitious, but the story is Prince Charles is having an affair with a lady who history knows as Tiggy Legg Burke. She was 30 years old. She was the nanny who looked after Harry and William. So that's the story that Bashir was passing on to Diana, that Prince Charles was planning to have her and Camilla murdered to clear the decks so that Charles can marry Tiggy Legg Burke.
Bit of context there, Tim, because Diana did have a bit of a difficult relationship with Tiggy in the sense that after their separation, Diana has the boys when she has the boys on her own terms, on her own turf, but she feels insecure because she's in Kensington Palace. They're very outdoorsy. She doesn't have the land for them to roam. She doesn't have the freedoms that are afforded other members of the royal family with huge estates. When they're in the care of their father, because Prince Charles, as the longest-serving heir apparent in history, is very, very busy, a workaholic and constantly abroad, they're then being looked after by Tiggy. But from a maternal point of view, that rankles with her. She loves her sons. Yeah. She doesn't really want another woman looking after them. She probably resents the relationship between the sons and Tiggy, and equally the relationship between Tiggy and Prince Charles, because he was extremely reliant on her. So it's absolutely playing into the heart of her insecurities in that post-separation arena.
That's both clever and wicked.
It's wicked, against the backdrop, of course, of literally hundreds of headlines of briefings and counter-briefings in the so-called War of the Waleses.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what's really interesting is, you might say to me, well, how do we know that Bashir came up with these things and passed them on? It's critical. There was a meeting. The first time that Martin Bashir meets Princess Diana was on September the 19th, 1995, at an apartment in Kensington. And at that, there were three people in the living room there, Diana, Martin Bashir, and Charles Spencer. So Charles Spencer was making notes on all of the information that was being unfolded by Bashir. And Charles said to me that he was absolutely conscious that he describes it as what Bashir was doing was playing battleships in the sense that he was putting out ideas, waiting to see which one landed the hardest. And he says that it was when the conversation turned to Tiggy Legg Burke presenting a threat, he says that is what Diana was clearly biting at.
It's so cruel, that, because she was a mother who
Well,
felt she had lost her grip.
She would not be the first mother in a sort of separation or divorce circumstances to be intensely jealous and ill-disposed towards another woman looking after her children.
Yeah.
That's not...
So when she agrees to the interview, she's doing it to save her life and her family, in her mind.
Yes, absolutely, and we know we know that's what she was doing. This is not just speculation, because of a meeting which took place 7 days before the fateful Panorama interview recording. That was recorded on November the 5th, 1995, at a meeting 7 days before. Patrick Jeffson was present at this meeting and has described to me exactly what happened. And Patrick has said that at that meeting, Diana was effectively dictating a set of things that she believed. And he said it was as much as anything like a last will and testament. A last will and testament that if, and these are his words, not mine, if she washed up in the Thames one morning, the world would know what had happened. So what you've got is a situation where Diana has been pumped full of these terrifying stories by somebody from the BBC, who we're all schooled to believe. The sort of way forward that had been worked out between Diana and Bashir, with Bashir very, very much driving this here. Diana was very, very much the innocent victim in this. Bashir had painted a scenario whereby, look, I've explained to you the dreadful, dark nature of the world as it is. You're going to do an interview on Panorama for me, but of course we're not going to talk about all that. We're going to keep that
between us.
What you're going to do is you're going to go on Panorama and really do two important things. One, you're going to make it absolutely clear to Buckingham Palace that you're not going anywhere. And that really was the abiding takeaway from that interview, that Diana was putting herself above the parapet, saying, several times during the interview, she effectively said, look, I'm tough. I'm not going to be pushed around.
And that is the whole Queen of People's Hearts shtick. She's trying to position herself for her future outside of the monarchy, but at the same time as a key figure in public life.
Absolutely. So that was meant to be the important, and indeed was the important takeaway from the interview. But the second one was really very critical, and this is in the last sort of 6 to 8 minutes of the interview. And from Buckingham Palace's point of view, this was the real nitty-gritty here. Because, first of all, Diana was asked, do you think you'll be Queen? She says, I don't think so. Do you think that Prince Charles should be king? At which point she effectively says, well, it's complicated. And she says, no, do you know what? I don't think he's really cut out to be king. Then she's asked, do you think William should take the throne instead of Charles? And she says, again, effectively yes. So what you've got there is a scenario where Diana is recommending that Charles doesn't, accede, but William does. Now, you link that with what Diana has also been told, that the Queen is going to abdicate in 6 months' time.
Yes.
And you begin to see this scenario that has been painted for her, which looks really quite attractive, because if at this point you're the separated wife of Prince Charles, you've been told that he wants to get married to the nanny and take your kids as step kids. Instead, something else can unfold here. When the Queen goes in 6 months' time, complete nonsense, of course, but in this scenario, the Queen goes in 6 months' time. Charles has just been told in no uncertain terms that he should, forgive me, bugger off to Highgrove and worry about his organic vegetables. Meanwhile, William, even though he's only 13 at this point, takes the crown. And where does Diana sit in that scenario? Well, she's the mother of the young man who is now the king.
Yes.
Now that is the scenario that had been painted for her, and I must say a very, very attractive one. That is why she went on Panorama and did what I think is actually wrong to think of as an interview, because an interview is a process between two people where one is asking questions and seeking information. This was a performance. It was a double act. It had been rehearsed. It had been, again, in the book, I go into it really quite precisely and forensically about how much time was spent in that interview room just that night alone.
Yes.
I mean, they were together that night for 5 hours, and I think the tape was rolling for 90 minutes or so on.
So it's basically, Andy, like a living epitaph in a way. And I think it's also worth reminding ourselves of how William reacts to this. So my understanding is that William is at Eton. Obviously, this documentary becomes the talk of the town, if not the world, because she describes Camilla as the third person in their marriage, but also confesses to having had an affair with James Hewitt. He's there, he's just arrived from prep school, he's already a bit up against it because he's a prince. He's then getting a load of flack, apparently, from other Etonians basically sniggering and laughing behind his back about this betrayal, really, he thinks, by his mother, because he's tearing his hair out thinking, we've had the press following us around our whole lives when we've gone on private holidays, when we've gone to Chessington, when I've turned up here at school, and now you're feeding this monster, which tells you a great deal actually about the subsequent mistrust of both William and Harry of the press. Simone Simmons, who was Princess Diana's healer, claimed, and it was never stood up or stood down, that he was so angry that when he came back from school, he has a physical fight with his mother about all this. We don't know that. But imagine the effect on him. And again, both of the boys are angry and upset because she hasn't consulted with them about even doing this.
I think you're right. I mean, all sorts of reasons. I mean, what I try and do in this is strip away the sort of the royal patina on this, because there is a temptation to think it's all a bit kind of, it's another world. No, what 13-year-old boy watching his mother on television talking about having sex with her, former boyfriend, hugely embarrassing. But not only that, it was a month after the Panorama interview goes out that the letter arrives from Windsor, from the Queen, saying you're going to get the divorce.
Yeah, enough's enough now.
Now, I just kind of think that teenagers, sort of in a situation where mum and dad are, it's not working, you hope, you pray, you cry your eyes out, hoping that it can be made to work. And what William saw was the marriage was utterly sundered, pretty much as a result of this interview. It was certainly the last nail in the coffin. That's terrible enough. When William subsequently realizes, and actually many years subsequently, but realizes, and this is really the nub of it, he realizes that had BBC managers, forget Bashir, he's done his wicked work, he's sort of off the stage, if you like, had BBC managers, when they knew that Bashir had commissioned forgeries, he'd deployed his forgeries, and he'd lied about it. They knew that, but they didn't pass that on to his mum. They didn't tell his mum.
When did they know that?
They knew that. We can say absolutely for definite when they knew that. They knew that as early as March of 1996. I mean, really quite soon after.
Wow.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I mean, they are entering this interview for every award going. It wins every award going. They are so proud of this interview, and they know that's how it's been obtained.
Yes, those things are true. I mean, BBC, and it wasn't every BBC manager, but there's a small knot of BBC managers who knew. They didn't know all the awful things that I've just described, the death, Prince Charles's, quotes, death plots and so on. They didn't know all of that. But what they did know, in my view, was utterly sufficient, necessitated, if for no other reason that you have a duty of care to a member of the public, whether they're a princess or not, if it's come to your attention that a member of your staff has had forgeries, he's used the forgeries and he's lied about the forgeries, this must be made known. If it had have been made known, and I think this is what is so heartbreaking for Diana's family, Charles Spencer, brother William, etc., so heartbreaking is that had Diana been briefed on what had been done up to that point, the whole thing would then have emerged, and her life would have been set on a different course that actually wouldn't have ended up in a tunnel in Paris.
So how did the interview put her on course for the tunnel in Paris?
Very good question. And I put that question to people, including Charles Spencer.
And Simone Simmons. I mean, Simone Simmons have been very clear, and they were very, very close. So all very well to dismiss Simone because she was a spiritual healer and therefore wasn't taken seriously. At that post-separation point, she was probably the closest woman in Diana's life, knew her exceptionally well. She directly blames Martin Bashir. She says if it wasn't for this interview, she wouldn't have ended up dead in the Alma Tunnel in 1997,
Why?
August the 31st, because she dispensed with Jeffson, who would have advised her about the wisdom of going off to Dodi Al-Fayed's yacht in the first place, and the photographic evidence of it that ensued that she was using to get back at Charles and others, that she wouldn't have dispensed with her taxpayer-funded bodyguards, Ken Wolfe and others, who were in her team. Well, she got rid of them because she
got rid of them.
Yeah, it was her choice. People have misreported, Andy, that she was stripped of them. She was never stripped of them. She was a very high-profile woman. She was an icon of the 20th century.
Yeah.
She needed to be protected from the public, let alone any lone nutters. She took that decision, and it is said that some of the compromises on her own personal safety that were made that fateful night wouldn't have occurred were it for her being, if she had still been looked after by Metropolitan Police officers, very well trained, SO 19
And she got
officers.
rid of them because she didn't trust them because of everything she had been fed.
Yes, I think so, Andy. Don't
So
you
if
agree?
the BBC had told us, sorry, that was all lies, then your thinking is she might have been more willing to use British protection.
Well, certainly on a
and to
practical
talk to the
level. I
family.
mean, she sacked her chauffeur because she'd been told the chauffeur was, part of some surveillance project. So her own chauffeur went.
Right.
But most important of all, and this is what Charles Spencer said to me, he said that it was the fact that Patrick Jeffson was no longer in the mix. That was utterly critical.
Yes.
Because he said, in Charles Spencer's word, Diana could be mercurial and somewhat difficult. They said, but why not? But Patrick was very, very good with her. He helped her to keep her feet on the ground. And the word it always comes back to me in this case is that in the not much more than 18 months which elapsed from the Panorama interview to Diana's death, her life became sort of somewhat untethered in a way. A lot of 1996 was taken up with the divorce, coming to fruition in the summer of 1996. Latterly, it's not very long before the relationship begins to develop with Dodi Fayed, and she then, very sadly, in August of 97, finds herself in Paris, protected by this sort of ramshackle operation run by Mohammed Al-Fayed with a drunken driver behind the wheel of the Mercedes, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So one isn't saying that it was, the Director General of the BBC who was driving the Mercedes that night. Of course he wasn't. But if this was your mum, and it is even arguable, even remotely possible, that she wouldn't have been there if they'd have done what they should have done. That's the situation I think William is in.
You're going to describe to us how the BBC covered it up. It all ends up getting exposed because Lord Dyson carries out an investigation, the findings of which are that Bashir has breached BBC guidelines, acted, the quote is, deceitfully, and both of the princes react. Let's hear Prince William reacting to the findings of that inquiry.
It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions. It is my firm view that this Panorama programme holds no legitimacy and should never be aired again. It effectively established a false narrative which for over a quarter of a century has been commercialised by the BBC and others.
Prince Harry then said that unethical practices ultimately caused Diana's death. I think this is an interesting quote. The ripple effect of a culture of exploitation and unethical practices ultimately took her life. To those who have taken some form of accountability, thank you for owning it. That is the first step towards justice and truth. Yet what deeply concerns me is that practices like these, and even worse, are still widespread today.
Can I come in on that? Because we know that Harry has always been a fierce critic of the tabloid press, print media in general, any media. I'm sorry, Andy, and do not for 1 minute think that this is me excusing phone hacking, because it isn't. I thought phone hacking was absolutely deplorable and an absolute stain on my industry and my profession. I think what Bashir did was far worse than phone hacking.
Who could disagree with that? I mean, what staggers me, frankly, is that there's been no criminal implications of this. If anybody goes and has a couple documents that are fake, forged bank statements, and you get yourself the world's most sought after interview that the BBC incidentally then sort of
deception and fraud
sold around the world for $1 million plus. Hang on. So is that fine then? I mean, can I do that if I want to?
Deception, fraud and forgery.
Gaslighting in modern parlance, and a certain element of coercive control.
But
Well,
let's
all of
talk
that as
about
well,
the
but
cover-up as well, Andy, because the other aspect of this, we have the conspiracy, we have these deplorable tactics employed by Martin Bashir, but almost as culpable are those BBC bosses who looked the other way.
I think so. I mean, when you talk about a cover-up, we can use that word because that is that phrase, because that's a phrase that Lord Dyson, who you mentioned, who conducted the inquiry, and in the book there are 3 chapters on this. I have, for what it's worth, very, very, very serious reservations about the quality of that inquiry. But he did use the term cover-up. He uses it in a very, very specific way about what it was that the BBC had covered up. In his view, what they covered up, a little bit complicated, but covered up really the fact, if you like, that they had held an inquiry at all. He doesn't make broad claims about what we would understand a cover-up to be, a sort of general desire to keep the lid on this thing. But so then, one is said, well, what evidence is there of a broader cover-up? Well, there are, in my view, many examples of such evidence. One in particular, we've heard a lot in recent days about the BBC board. At the time in 1996, it was called the Board of Governors, but effectively it was the same. Their role was the same. They were the watchdogs, if you like, there to sort of stand by, but keep an eye on what the BBC is doing. Just keep an eye, and if they really go too far, they're going to step in. And so they're the watchdogs. Tony Hall was called before them.
Former Director General.
Absolutely, yes, of course. Tony Hall, who then became Director General in later years, but he was at this point head of news. You're quite right. He is called before the Board of Governors to sort of explain like what's happening. And the reason he'd been called before them was the story had just begun to dribble out a little bit. The Mail on Sunday had been pushing very hard, and they'd published something. The Board of Governors called a meeting and said, right, explain what's happening here. Tell us all about it. And Hall went before that meeting, and I think it's absolutely critical. There must have been a 10-minute period in that meeting that, in my view, if that 10 minutes had gone differently, we'd be living in a different country today. Because what he said to the governors was not that Martin Bashir had commissioned forged documents and deployed them to a member of the public, Charles Spencer in this case, and that he'd lied about it. Didn't say that. Didn't say that to the Board of Governors. He said to the Board of Governors that he'd examined what had happened, and that Martin Bashir, in his view, quotes, was an honest and honourable man. Now, okay, I have spoken to four members of that board constituted at that time are now dead. The youngest surviving member of the board is Sir Richard Eyre, who is a distinguished ex-theatre director, etc. Mm-hmm. I said to Sir Richard, look, had you been told the truth, had Hall told you what we know the case to be, what would you have done? And he said, it's absolutely clear. We would have called for a full inquiry.
Yes.
We would have insisted on a full inquiry. Now, had that happened, at that point, all these awful, other terrible things would have emerged. Diana would have been briefed, and that is why history would have been different. Because
Right.
it's not going too far to paint a scenario where Diana doesn't end up in the Paris tunnel. She's here today. She's 64 years old. She's got 5 grandkids. That's the other scenario that could have unfolded had Hall told the whole truth that day.
And it's difficult not to see parallels with the current debates around Panorama and Trump, but also Gaza and trans rights, etc. Does this all point to the BBC having a culture which prioritizes protecting the institution over admitting errors?
Possibly it does. I mean, I think I would not actually be quite that charitable in this case, because back in when we're talking about 1996 here, yes, the BBC managers may have said, "Oh, we had to do this to protect the institution." I think they did it to protect their jobs.
Right.
Because had it emerged what Bashir had done, yes, it would have been terribly embarrassing for the BBC, but the Director General, the head of news, maybe 2 or 3 others would have been out of the door in that afternoon.
But there is also an extraordinary sting in the tail of this story, because in 2016, Jonathan Monroe, who is now the acting CEO of BBC News following the departure of Deborah Turnus, decides it's a good idea to rehire Martin Bashir as religious affairs correspondent.
That's the most amazing bit of it, by the way, religious affairs.
Now, I did work with Bashir because he had previously been at MSNBC, and when I did both of the royal weddings for NBC, that's the umbrella network in the US, he wasn't supposed to do it, but I was on a panel to compare that royal wedding between Kate and William outside Buckingham Palace, Meredith Vieira, Matt Lauer of the Today Show, most famous kind of programme on that network, the morning show, so to speak, alongside Andrew Roberts. I was the royal expert, he was the historian, and Brian Williams, another very, very famous NBC news anchor, was going to star alongside. He had to pull out at the last minute because there was a tornado somewhere in the deep south, and the person they drafted in was Martin Bashir. So I worked with him that day. Andrew, I don't want to speak to Andrew for Andrew, but Andrew and I both found him to be quite strange. He leaves MSNBC over a controversy involving Sarah Palin. It's quite grotesque what he actually suggested should happen to Sarah Palin, so let's just leave that there. He's in disgrace, really. There are more than rumours bubbling up at the BBC about his conduct during the Panorama interview. He's left America and American broadcasting under a cloud of suspicion, but the BBC rehires him. I find that extraordinary and staggering. Andy?
No, you won't be alone in thinking that's staggering, because the BBC, as you say, the scandal that you refer to there with Sarah Palin, that followed hot on the heels of another scandal at his prior network where he'd said grotesquely sexist and sexually charged things at a public event, etc. So he's been sacked or resigned very quickly from there, then big trouble at MSNBC. Then, as you say, he comes back to the UK. Absolutely nothing happening for Martin Bashir until he goes to the BBC. And I've thought many times, and this is purely me thinking this, but from the point of view of some senior people at the BBC, do you want Martin Bashir kicking around maybe for the next couple of decades without a job and wondering, how can I turn my finances around? Who knows?
I mean, we just don't know that. Martin Bashir hasn't really responded to many inquiries post the inquiry because he has had quadruple heart bypass surgery. Then he had another heart operation in spring 2020. He was hospitalised in late 2020 for COVID-related health issues. I mean, he resigned as the religious editor in 2021, shortly before the Dyson report was published, citing ongoing health issues. That was his last professional activity. He has retired from the public eye since and has made no official comments on his health or career.
Your book is coming out next week.
The 20th, and yes, and that date has been chosen long ago by the publishers, because that is literally 30 years to the day of the infamous Panorama interview.
Can it have been
November 20th.
30 years? Goodness me.
Now, Tim Davie has already announced that he's leaving. Had he not made that announcement and your book had come out, do you think that would have been doubly uncomfortable for Tim Davie?
I know it would have been doubly uncomfortable for Tim Davie. The question in my mind is, did he make his decision to go after this particular new scandal rather than wait another 7 or 8 days for the next scandal? Because absolutely, I mean, in the book, and we've only got so much time, but in the book, very, very serious questions are raised about Tim Davie's handling of the scandal as it began to erupt in 2020.
Yeah, that's when he first becomes Director General, actually. So are there suggestions, Andy, that you didn't take it seriously enough, that you tried to sweep it under the carpet?
Yes, more than just suggestions. I mean, Charles Spencer, and again, the email is actually in the book. Charles Spencer emailed privately Tim Davie, saying, look, Mr. Davie, terrible things have happened, and I've got documents back at, in my office to prove that. Tim Davie's response to that, to paraphrase, was, your story does not accord with the story we've been told by Martin Bashir. But hang on, the BBC knows that Martin Bashir is a serial liar. So what? And this was what made Charles Spencer so utterly furious, that the BBC was saying, oh, you say X, Martin Bashir says Y, and we're going to go with Y. And at that point, Charles Spencer just that's it, I'm out of here. The documents that he had, he decided to take to the Daily Mail, as it was, because of past relationships. Went to the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail then had 5 front-page splashes,
yes, it all blows
terrible
up.
scandal, etc., etc. And it's once those 5 front pages have gone by that Tim Davie, with all his professed love of transparency and openness and accountability, it's only then that he says, right, yeah, we're going to have an inquiry into this. Now, he had been offered privately, in a grown-up, dignified way by Charles Spencer, because he is by no means somebody who is running to the press with this extraordinary material. Charles Spencer wanted it. Charles Spencer is a real BBC, a wannabe BBC fan.
Yes.
He refuses to say that the BBC is a corrupt. He continually says there are people at the BBC who...
Bad apples.
Bad apples, exactly. He wanted this to be dealt with. I mean, of course, the nature of the information he had, etc., it would have emerged, but he wanted it to emerge in a dignified way, a proper way, not in 5 front pages, frankly, in the Daily Mail.
But he was desperate.
But it was Davie's response that he just lost patience. The other point, maybe to bring out as regards Tim Davie, I think, a difficult, very, very difficult thing he would have to answer had he hung on for a further few days is this, that I had been putting in various freedom of information requests for certain documents, and to prevent me getting them, Tim Davie has sanctioned the spending of more than £1 million of licence fee money to stop me seeing those emails. Now, again, if your shtick is transparency, accountability, and indeed a proper stewardship of these public funds, for it to be fully explained and demonstrated just how you spent £1 million on stopping a journalist, a writer, seeing what you've been up to, that's not a good look. And that's why I genuinely think he knew that these things were going to come out soon, and I kind of think it's not impossible to think, look, how many scandals can I weather, and which one do I want to take the bullet for?
Yes.
Is it, yeah.
Also, let's not forget that the BBC ended up paying libel damages to Tiggy Legborg, also a substantial payout to Patrick Jeffson. But just to end on a positive note, Andy and Tim. So I'm just looking back at the story I did. March 2022, headlined, Relief for Princess Diana's Private Secretary Paid Damages by BBC over Martin Bashir interview. It was an undisclosed sum, but I believe it to have been tens of thousands of pounds.
110,000. But
Do you know what Jeffson did with it?
What did he do with it?
He gave it to a Welsh hospice, a charity that Princess Diana was associated with. And I'm just going to pick out the quote because I think it's important in this story that we we've talked about the worst, but let's just talk about the best, because there were people around her that cared about her. You know, a lot of history's been rewritten, the so-called men in grey suits. There were people that had her best interests at heart, and unfortunately they were defenestrated from her in the most appalling way ever. But he said to me, "This was the last patronage I helped to organise for the princess. We arranged a concert with Luciano Pavarotti to raise money to build the hospice, but Diana died before construction was finished. Having thought about it very hard, I realised that money couldn't reverse the harm done, but giving my award to T. Haffan feels right. It changes something bad into something good, and that's a blessing."
just a sort of note on top of that, as I understand it, Kate, Princess Kate, was very, very keen that she assumed the patronage of that hospice as a marker of Diana's concern as well.
Andy Webb, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If you're enjoying our journalism, why not sign up to From the Editor, our free email newsletter? Start your day with the latest news and opinion, plus our bite-sized puzzles. Scan the QR code to sign up free today.